our Evolution and Culture speaker series. We're almost done with our winter quarter series. Our last talk of the quarter will be next week on March 8th. It will be Peter Fashing from the Cal State Fullerton Department of Anthropology. His talk is called Behavioral Ecology of East Africa. Costs and benefits of group living in colobus and gelada monkey societies. And then we will break for spring break and then return for the spring quarterback series, which you will find posted online. This week it is my great pleasure to introduce Russell Gray from the University of Aukland Department of Psychology, who will be talking to us today about Darwinizing culture with phylogenies.
Thanks, Mike. Great to be here. But imagine you're not here. Imagine instead that you are planning a field trip in the Pacific. And perhaps as part of that, you thought, what I really need to do is learn a few words in some of the languages that I might be going to encounter. So you might start with some fairly basic things like, what's the word for five in different languages across the Pacific? And so you would see that in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the word is rima. In Fijian, it's lima. In Samoa, it's lima. In Tahiti, it's rima. In Rapa Nui, Easter Island, it's rima. And in Hawaii, it's lima. I think that's kind of curious. Those things look a bit similar. You might look more widely and see that in the Solomons, it's also lima. In Turquoise and Micronesia, it's Nemu. In New Britain, in some of the languages there, it's Lima. And tracking back through Indonesia and all the way off the screen here to Madagascar, there's a similar word. And in Cebuano, in the Philippines, it's Lima. And in Amis in Taiwan, it's Rima and Lima. And you would think, these are very striking parallels. Perhaps there's something going on here. And being careful scientists, you might want to gather a bit more data and see that the term for two also, in these very far-flung languages and cultures, also shows remarkable similarity in its form. And to be struck, as many as the early European explorers were, that these similarities couldn't have arisen through chance. That the most probable explanation is these similarities reflect descent with modification from a common origin. And in thinking about this way about languages and about cultures, you'd be joining a very long list of scholars going back at least to Darwin, who noticed the kind of striking similarities between the way in which biological species might evolve and languages might change. And Darwin noticed that the formation of different languages and of distinct species, and the proofs that both have been developed through a gradual process, are curiously parallel. We find in distinct languages striking homologies due to communities of descent and analogies due to a similar process of formation. So, descent with modification can explain things about culture and language, perhaps in the same way it can in biology. Now, there's a rather kind of polemical debate about just to what extent we can Darwinize culture, to what extent those kind of rather loose analogies about evolutionary change in language and culture can be applied. Richard Lewontin, in his classic 1970 paper on the units of selection, can argue that culture can be thought of as an evolving system. He wrote that it's important to note a certain generality of principles. No particular mechanism of inheritance is specified, only a correlation in fitness between parent and offspring. The population would evolve whether the correlation between parent and offspring arose from Mendelian, cytoplasmic, or cultural inheritance. So this is Lewontin 1970 saying, yes, culture in some sense can evolve. More recently, there's been a somewhat unexplained flip where Dick Lewontin now argues that there's no really substantial sense in which you can talk about culture evolving. That in particular, he finds the application of selectionist explanations to cultural phenomena vacuous, misleading, and pseudo-explanatory. You see him here arguing that it doesn't contribute anything new except a misleading vocabulary that anaesthetizes history. So, what's going on here? Well, part of it has been a kind of reaction, I think, to trying to find too close parallels between the exact kind of inheritance mechanisms that apply in biology and the inheritance mechanisms that apply in culture. And there's been a long and kind of rather semantic debate about the validity of whether there are means, whether there are exact cultural equivalents of phylogenes. And I think Lewinton, as a critic of Dawkins, is particularly opposed to kind of memetics. But there might be other ways of Darwinizing culture that don't require us to think that there are direct lineages of copies in cultural evolution as there are in biological evolution. In genetic evolution, you have one-to-one lineages of copies, and nothing like that exactly applies in culture. Another way of Darwinizing culture might be to think not in terms of direct application of population genetics or memetics, but instead in terms of phylogenies. Because these days, phylogenies absolutely rule in evolutionary biology. Go to any conference, open any textbook, and there's wall-to-wall phylogenies. Phylogenies have replaced kind of sort of population genetics as the central inference engine in historical inference in evolutionary biology. And of course, phylogenies famously at least go back to Darwin's famous drawing in June 1837 in his notebook, where he drew this early family tree showing descent and modification and diversification of lineages. And this is how Darwin thought about cultural and linguistic phenomena. In the Descent he wrote that if we possessed a perfect pedigree of mankind and a genealogical arrangement of the races would afford the best classification of the languages now spoken throughout the world. So, in this way of thinking about kind of languages and cultures, in many ways even predates tree thinking or phylogenetic thinking in evolutionary biology. Here's an early tree for the Indo-Germanic languages, and here's a very early tree for manuscript traditions. So tree thinking has a long history in terms of thinking about cultural and linguistic phenomena, just as it does in biology. If you think about trees and think about the words we looked at, there can, in some cultural phenomena, be remarkably high fidelity transmission, in spite of the fact that there's not direct gene-like lineages of copies. So here what I've done is just map those two terms for 5 and 2 on a tree of Austronesian languages. And this tree goes back about 5,200 years. Now, we can ask, so how faithful has the replication of these kind of linguistic variants been? Now, it's not just that these have been faithfully replicated with only minor variations for 5,000 years, because you really need to add up the time along all the branches. So the fidelity of this cultural replication is actually quite remarkable, because when we do that on a tree of, say, 400 languages, there's an equivalent of over 400,000 years of cultural evolution. So there can, in some cultural phenomena, be quite remarkably high fidelity cultural inheritance over very, very long periods of time, without gene-like kind of processes of replication and transmission. Okay, so that's kind of by way of general theoretical introduction. What I'm going to be arguing is that one way of Darwinizing culture is to think not in terms of memetics, but to think in terms of kind of phylogenies. And what I'm going to do is outline 3 potential benefits of thinking about language and culture in explicitly phylogenetic terms. So what I'm going to be doing is applying computational methods derived from evolutionary biology to the study of language and culture. That's what I want to do in the sort of first 2/3 of the talk. And in the final third, what I want to do is say that I think there are some perils that we need to be aware of in this kind of process. And I want to look at some potential limitations of using computational phylogenetic methods. In particular, the idea that a lot of cultural phenomena are not well modelled by tree-like evolution, and also that a lot of cultural phenomena, there's not the same degree of coherence of lineages as there is in vertebrate evolution. Okay, that's where we're going. I want to begin by focusing on the Austronesian language family, a group of about 1,200 languages, perhaps the largest language family in the world, spread all the way from Taiwan with the Formosan languages to Madagascar, to Aotearoa, New Zealand, to Rapa Nui, to Hawaii. And the first thing I want to do is see how computational phylogenetic methods can give insight into hypotheses about the origins and spread of these Austronesian speakers. There are two main hypotheses for the peopling of the Pacific. The first, we've sort of dubbed a pulse-pause model. It's been proposed with sort of different variants by people like Peter Bellwood, Jared Diamond, Andy Pauly, and Roger Green. And in this kind of model of the peopling of the Pacific, the Austronesian speakers can be traced back to a homeland in Taiwan about 5,500 years ago. There's a long pause before the settlement of the Philippines, a rapid expansion through Indonesia and the Philippines, Borneo, Sulawesi, out along the New Guinea coast, as far as Fiji and Tonga. Then another long pause before the settlement of the most remote parts of Oceania. That's why we call it a pulse-pause model. A pause here, a rapid pulse, another pause, and then an expansion pulse to remote parts of Polynesia. Now that's in strong contrast to what has been dubbed the slow boat model of Pacific settlement. And this has been advocated not by linguists, but primarily by geneticists, Stephen Oppenheimer and Martin Richards, who've argued on the basis of the dating of mitochondrial haplotypes that the Austronesian speakers originated in an area they dubbed Wallacea around here, and there was a two-pronged movement north to the Philippines and Taiwan, and in this direction, eastwards out into the Pacific. Now, one of the things that evolutionary biologists like to do is to try and tease apart hypotheses in terms of the predictions they make. And those two hypotheses make some quite striking different predictions about where any language tree should be rooted and the shape of its branching sequence, about the age of the Austronesian language family, and about where the theories really put their neck on the line is that the predictions about the exact location and timing of those pulses and pauses in Pacific settlement. So to test those hypotheses, what Simon Greenhill and I have been doing is working with linguists and building up a very large database of basic vocabulary for Austronesian languages. So what we did was to take things that look a bit like this, which is a word list of basic vocabulary. This is Lenacal, a Vanuatu language, and you can see terms for hand, for left, for right, for bones, intestines, to vomit. It turns out one of the most stable items in Austronesian is vomit, and head louse is also another very stable item in Austronesian languages.
Head louse.
Yeah. So what we've done is to take these basic bits of paper and convert them into a web-accessible database that you can now see online. We think now have about 660 of the 1,200 Austronesian languages. We have 210 items of basic vocabulary, and you can see we've got a good coverage across the whole range of Austronesian speakers. This has been a collaborative project, and we've worked closely with linguists to code this information and basic vocabulary. What do I mean by coding the data? Well, linguists, as probably you're aware, have a term called cognate, which is equivalent to the sort of biologist term homology. So cognates are words, they're not just lookalikes, they're words that, while they might be similar in form and meaning, they need to show systematic sound correspondences in order to be judged really homologous. So it's been a sort of exhausting 6-year project collecting all this basic vocabulary data and then working with linguists to make these cognate judgments. So here you can just see a very simple case where we have some languages, we have terms for father, and you can see there are two cognate sets there. One something like tama and another something like matua. And so what we do is take these different cognate sets, this is a sort of multi-state coding of the data, and we convert them into a binary code. So the analysis I'm going to talk about, we end up with a matrix of 400 languages by over 34,000 cognate sets. This is sort of data comparable to the size of a complete mitochondrial genome. to test the hypotheses about the origin and spread of these specific peoples, we have these 400 languages. We have some outgroups, a controversial one, Old Chinese, a less controversial outgroup language, reticulate and Huyang, and the matrix of these 400 languages by 34,000 odd cognate sets. We used Bayesian phylogenetic inference. We were kind enough to have some friends in Reading who let us run many analyses on their computer cluster of 150 nodes for over 3 months. And what we end up with is not a single tree. What we're going to be doing is estimating the trees and using those to test those hypotheses about the origin and timing. But the Bayesian methods we use don't produce a single tree, but rather a distribution of trees sampled in proportion to their posterior probability. And that's great because we get explicit estimates of the uncertainty in our estimates. And if we were to overlay the set of 10,000 most probable trees, this is what they kind of look like. This is called a denser tree. And you can see the overlaid, there's a lot of robust support for lots of these groupings. There's also some kind of uncertainty in regions of the tree estimates. It's a bit hard to look at these things and exactly know what's happening. So to simplify, we can show that kind of tree structure as a consensus tree. And thinking of that first hypothesis about the origin of the Austronesian speakers, remember in the sort of pulse-pause model, the prediction was it should be Taiwan at the basal parts of the tree. In the slowboat model, it should be the Walisian area. And you can see here the sort of summary tree that I've drawn here. All the basal lineages are in Taiwan, these Formosan languages here. So that's kind of strike one in favour of the pulse-pause model. The basal lineages are all the Formosan languages spoken here.
Does your outgroup matter?
We've played around with different outgroups and it doesn't really matter, no. So we think that that's pretty robust. And we also use methods that don't assume an outgroup and we still get that kind of result. So pretty confident about the wording there. The second thing is about the sequence. And you can see that in this kind of summary tree, the sequence fits rather nicely with the sequence proposed by the pulse-pause model. So here you have the Philippines, like with the Taiwanese languages, here's the Taiwanese languages, then those in the kind of Philippines, Borneo, Sulawesi and Indonesia, then to the areas around the Moluccas and South Halmahera, West New Guinea, then around the Bismarcks, and then out into the far reaches of Oceania. So the chain-like topology here fits rather nicely with the expansion sequence predicted by the pulse-pause model. But what about the dating? Where the theory, where the pulse-pause model really puts its neck on the line is those very precise predictions about where in the tree we'd expect to see long pauses and where on the tree we'd expect to see really short internodes, rapid expansion pulse. Here's one of our trees, it's a maximum clade credibility tree, where the branch lengths are proportional to the amount of change. In order to get dates, we need to rescale this so these branches are proportional to time. And you can just see, by the way, that the rate of linguistic change in here, in different parts of the tree, is not at all clock-like. There's huge kind of rate variation in these different lineages. So how do we get dates? Well, one of the great things about linguistic data potentially is that there's lots of potential calibration points. And the Pacific is really good for this because there's good archaeological evidence about uninhabited islands and when they're inhabited. So we can get some calibration points at different parts of the tree that we can use to constrain their unrate rescaled tree in order to get a tree where the branches are scaled proportional to time. And these are just some of the calibrations we used. We also used ancient manuscripts and ancient languages. And we did a lot playing around with the kind of relative robustness of our dating to different assumptions about those calibration points. I'm just going to skip over that, that's about looking at pottery. Remember the two hypotheses. One predicted, the pulse-pause model predicted an age of about 5,500 years. The slowboat model predicted an age between 13 and 17,000 years. Here what we've done is to plot a distribution of our estimates for the age of Austronesian. And here's the range predicted by the slowboat model, and you can see that our distribution falls very tightly in the range, exactly the range predicted by the pulse-pause model. So that's another strike in favour of the pulse-pause model. And just to kind of show how robust that kind of date estimate of that basal part of the tree is, I want you to compare. That's when we used all 14 calibrations. This is where we just used one calibration based on lapita pottery and associated cultural artifacts and 3 terminal parts of the tree. So compare that with that. And you can see that the date estimates are kind of strikingly kind of robust. Okay, what about the pulse-pause predictions? Here's a kind of summary tree where the branches are scaled in proportion to time, and you can see it shows the expansion sequence from Taiwan through the Philippines, Borneo, Sulawesi, Indonesia, out to Polynesia. But what's really striking to me is that exactly where the pulse-pause model predicted long pauses is where we find the pauses. Here are the Formosan languages, here are the languages of the Philippines. And we get this really long branch of over 1,000 years here. What's going on here? To get from Taiwan to the Philippines, you have to cross across the Bashi Strait, which has strong northward currents. So one of the suggestions has been that in order to cross the strait, the invention of outrigger canoes was necessary. And terms for outrigger canoes and associated with their technology can only be reconstructed back to Proto-Polynesian, this node on the tree, not back into the Formosan languages. So it seems that this tree with this long pause is not only kind of enabling us to test hypotheses about prehistory, but giving us insight into the kind of cultural processes that might have produced these broader kind of macroscopic, macro kind of patterns. You can also see this incredibly rapid expansion pulse that in less than 1,000 years, people got all the way from the Philippines out to Polynesia, out to central Polynesia, a distance of over about 7,000 kilometres. And then again, another long pause before the most remote parts of Polynesia were settled. So I think that shows a lot of the power of using computational phylogenetic methods to test quite precise hypotheses about events in human history. The second thing I want to do is say that thinking in this kind of phylogenetic way about languages enables us to kind of synthesize different lines of evidence. For example, to see how the kind of inferences based on language might link to inferences based on genetics. And there's a bit of a puzzle in Polynesian genetics. If you look mitochondrially at Polynesians, about over 95% of Polynesians appear so-called Asian in their mitochondria, or Southeast Asian in their mitochondria. But if you look at non-recombining Y haplotypes, they look, and there are problems with these terms, they look so-called Melanesian. So it seems that perhaps the men and the women have different kind of histories in Polynesia. The mitochondrial story is telling a different kind of pattern to the Y chromosome story. And just to show what SNP data has been showing, or not SNP data, STR data, if you look across the whole kind of genome, it looks like Polynesians are about 80% so-called Asian and only about 20% so-called Melanesian. So what might we be able to do to kind of explain or to test hypotheses about why the genetic story shows that kind of sex difference patterns in history? Well, working with Fiona Jordan, we've been interested in making inferences, given our language trees, about what the ancestral states of the societies were. Now, imagine we're interested in post-marital residence patterns, and perhaps we think there's been some changes there that might have produced these patterns. If this is a tree relating these different cultures, and say all these ones in blue have patrilocal residence, and all these ones in yellow have matrilocal residence, the kind of simple passing inference would be that ancestrally they were matrilocal, and then they switched at this branch to patrilocality. So that's just a kind of sort of very simple example about how you might be able to use a tree showing the historical relationships of languages to make inferences about ancestral states of social organisation, a kind of virtual social archaeology. Now, one of the hypotheses has been that ancestrally oceanic speakers and Austronesian speakers were matrilocal. So the women tended to stay put and there was much more mobility with the men. And if that was true, that would explain the incongruence between the mitochondrial and the genetic evidence. If we look at the distribution of matrilocality and patrilocality across our kind of sample of languages and cultures, you can see it's quite mixed. What we're going to do is use phylogenetic methods to estimate the states, the probability that Austronesian speakers were matrilocal and that oceanic speakers were matrilocal. So what we do is we take our set of language trees, not a single tree, but our set of language trees, we look at the states on the various tips and then estimate the ancestral states. And you can see here that we estimate for Proto-Polynesian there was a 99% posterior probability that it was matrilocal. So that would fit with the idea that it was matrilocality that can explain the difference in the genetic evidence. The prediction about the state of oceanic doesn't quite work. The inference there is mixed. There's about a 67% probability that Proto-Oceanic was patrilocal, but we can't statistically discriminate between patrilocality and matrilocality at that node. And I think, and I've had arguments with kind of Ruth and Fiona about this, that this might be due to one of the ways in which some of these tree-based methods break down. Because I think there's a strong probability that this node actually was, based on other linguistic evidence, matrilocal. But what's happened in this region is this all around Papua New Guinea. There's been lots of contact with non-Austronesian speakers who are non-Austronesian cultures that are typically patrilocal. So there's been lots of independent borrowing of, due to contact of patrilocal residence patterns. That would be my interpretation of what's happened here. Okay, so far I've argued that thinking about cultural phylogenies gives us a way of making inferences about prehistory. It enables us to kind of do a virtual kind of social archaeology that might link genetic and cultural data. What I want to turn to is a kind of what I take as a bit of a challenge from Dick Lewington here. Because one of his kind of things is that his claim that all these studies that try and use Darwinian thinking to look at culture don't really produce any kind of insight. He says that social hierarchy and inequality are explained just as a consequence of differential cultural fitness of individuals or the cultural traits they bear, rather than, say, as a consequence of antagonistic and exploitative social relations. So the kind of challenge I take is, can we produce anything of substance about the evolution of social and political complexity? Now, as you all no doubt know, there's been a long history of investigations into this topic in anthropology, and in particular, kind of in the Pacific. And people have wondered about what are the kind of paths and what are the kind of processes that enable us to go from, say, kind of hunter-gatherers to highly stratified complex societies. One way some hypotheses about the sequence of changes in political complexity can be tested is to once again use phylogenies. So imagine we had a hypothesis that you went from this yellow state to this blue state to this black state. And our tree for the cultures looked like this. That sequential hypothesis would fit perfectly with that tree, but rather poorly with this trees. So you can use the trees to make inferences about the relative fit of different sequential hypotheses. Now, in the Pacific, people have for a long time produced various kind of classifications that are sort of pseudo-evolutionary hypotheses about the changes in social complexity in the Pacific and the way that might be kind of categorized. Lots of complex issues here about the kind of coding. What Tom Curry has been doing with some help from us is to classify the different types of social organisation or social political complexity in the Pacific into acephalous societies. These are societies with often with big men but no kind of formal chiefs. A kind of poster child example of that might be motu, where people compete for status through competitive bouts of eating. So I saw people eating different amounts here. Imagine if your status in this room was determined by how much you could eat. That's what life is like in motu. Things are rather different in Tonga, where there's lots of parts of the Pacific, there's simple chiefdoms, but in places like Tonga and Hawaii, there's 2 levels of jurisdictional hierarchy. There's paramount chiefs as well as lower level chiefs. And in a small number of places, you've got complex states. And Bali would be one of those examples with its highly Indianized caste system. So one way of formalizing that is to think, well, given that classification with 4 different levels of social and political complexity, we might want to ask, how has cultural evolution worked? Has the evolution been this simple unilinear or rectilinear mode, where it's gone from acephalous societies to simple chieftains to complex chieftains to state-like systems? Now, that sounds very 19th century linear and kind of progressive. Another kind of possibility might be this unilinear model, where changes have again gone incrementally and gradually, no big saltationary jumps, but 1 step in each direction. And another variant of that model might be to assume that you can increase in social complexity only in small steps, but you can lose social complexity in big jumps. And there's a number of more complex models where kind of any kind of transition is possible. Now, using computational phylogenetic methods, it's possible to statistically test between the fit of these different models, to ask whether the Bayes factor for this model is better than the Bayes factor for this model, or the Bayes factor for that model. So in other words, we can evaluate these hypotheses about the sequence of cultural evolution in these cultures. A quick show of hands. I kind of like to make people put their money where their mouth is. Who thinks, so I'm going to test these hypotheses. Who thinks that the rectilinear hypothesis is going to receive the most support? One person. One brave person. Who thinks the unilinear hypothesis is going to receive the most support? Very few. Who thinks the relaxed unilinear model is going to receive a lot of support? Okay, increasing confidence. What about the full, anything goes kind of model? That's quite big. So, I think there's about 90 odd cultures we have sampled here, and you can see you've got a distribution with some acephalous societies shown in white, or in green, sorry, simple chieftains shown in white, complex chieftains shown in blue, and states shown in kind of yellow. When we do the kind of the model testing, what we find is that the dotted lines show very weak probabilities of transitions between those states. So here's acephalous, here's simple chieftain, here's complex chieftain, here's states. The lines are roughly proportional to the kind of rate estimates of transitions between these states. And looking at this, it looks like the one you voted for the most received the greatest support. That's the kind of relaxed unilinear model, where things can go up or down in one step, but they can also drop back, go downwards, devolution, if you like, in big jumps. When we actually do the statistical estimation, the Bayes factor for this relaxed unilinear model is not any better than the simple unilinear model. So actually, the unilinear model is a very good fit to the data. So what I've been arguing so far is there's a lot of things we can do by thinking in terms of trees and making inferences about language and culture. We can test hypotheses about prehistory, we can make inferences about ancestral states of social organisation, and we can test these kind of hypotheses about sequences of cultural organisation. But there are some warnings along the way that maybe life isn't always quite as simple as this. And I think two of the perils of this kind of phylogenetic thinking are what I call kind of debates about the shape and the fabric of human history. The first one is, what if the kind of history is not well described or modelled by a tree? what about all the kind of borrowing that takes place between languages and cultures? And the second one is that what if the kind of cultural histories are much more complex, that unlike kind of vertebrate histories where, what if cultures are not like species, or vertebrate species, that there's not a single history to be estimated, but many different kind of histories. And therefore the fabric of cultural evolution is not very cohesive. I think these are good concerns. As is often the case, Stephen Jay Gould puts these things rather bluntly. He says, human cultural evolution proceeds along paths outstandingly different from the ways of genetic change. Biological evolution is constantly diverging. Once lineages become separate, they cannot amalgamate. Trees are the correct topologies of biological evolution, and human cultural evolution, on the other hand, transmission and anastomosis are rampant. 5 minutes with a wheel, a snowshoe, a bobbin, or a bow and arrow may allow an artisan of one culture to capture a major achievement of another. So for kind of Gould, this entire enterprise would seem kind of bankrupt given the alleged prevalence of borrowing in language and culture. But I think this Mursi woman from Ethiopia shows why that kind of rather simple analysis is both true but not as powerful as people might think. Because you can see here that she has two cultural borrowings, some of the most widespread things in recent times. I think this is an AK-47 and that's definitely an iPod. But she's also maintained her highly traditional kind of patterns of kind of facial decoration and necklace and things like that. So it's not enough to make these kind of verbal arguments that, look, there's lots of borrowing going on in language and culture. Because yes, some things might be borrowed, like nifty cultural inventions, but also some things might be very stable. So what we need is methods that enable us to examine particular data and look at particular examples to see what's stable and reliably kind of vertically inherited and what's not. And to perhaps produce a more kind of general theory about what kind of processes and what kind of situations produce relatively tree-like coherent evolution versus less coherent evolution. Now, it turns out that Gould has a sort of rather vertebrate stereotype of what happens in biological evolution. In prokaryote evolution, things are very far from tree-like. So increasingly in biology, there's a lot of interest in computing networks, not family trees for species, but networks. And these things, this is a Spitz graph, and they're a bit hard to read at first glance, but they're a way of showing or visualizing the amount of conflicting signal in any data set. So imagine this is German, and this is English, and this is French. Now we know that English is a Germanic language, so this blue split would show the sort of support, relative support for grouping English as part of a Germanic group. But we also know that English has borrowed a lot from French, and that would produce this conflicting, French being a Romance language, that would produce this conflicting red split here, where English is grouped not with German, but with French. So these methods give us a way of kind of visualizing the extent of conflicting signal. And if we look at situations where we know the history has been more complex, for example, with Creole languages, one of the kind of poster child Creole languages is Shrenan, spoken in Suriname, that it's a kind of hybrid, if you like, of kind of Dutch and English formed by African slaves. Now, if we look at a Spitz graph built using the neighbornet algorithm for Shrenan, what you can see is, yes, there's strong support grouping it with English, as you'd expect, but also, as you'd expect, there's strong conflicting signals shown in blue here, grouping it with Dutch and some other related languages. So these networks give us a way of visualizing the amount of conflicting signal in any kind of particular data set. And one of the ways you can quantify the extent of that conflicting signal is using these delta scores. So these methods are far from perfect, but they give us a way of sort of looking at the data before building trees in terms of visualizing how much conflicting signal and quantifying the extent of that non-conflicting signal. Okay, given that we know that even in basic vocabulary, the kind that we collected for Austronesian, is known to have less borrowing than just a kind of random sample of the total lexicon, But even in basic vocabulary, there can be borrowing. Given that there is this borrowing, an obvious question is to what extent will that borrowing, which cannot always be detected, to what extent will that bias our estimates? So with Simon Greenhill and Tom Curry, I've been doing a number of computer simulations, varying the amount of kind of what would be called undetected borrowing, and using a range of different scenarios. So here we looked at the ability to recover the true tree in a simulated data set, given different levels of borrowing from 0 through to kind of 50%, and on 2 different tree topologies, and with different borrowing scenarios. On the top scenario, it was just borrowing within languages that had split within 1,000 years. In the middle scenario, there was borrowing within languages that had split within 3,000 years, and in the final scenario, there was borrowing randomly across the tree, which I think is not a particularly plausible scenario. What we have measured here is a tree comparison metric which shows the distance between our estimated trees and the sort of known true phylogeny. And what you can see is that under most scenarios, it requires very high levels of borrowing in order to substantially bias the estimates of trees. So this gives me some confidence that, at least with basic vocabulary where the relative rates of borrowing are quite low, and in situations where we can remove some of that kind of obvious borrowing, our estimates of the population history based on basic vocabulary are not going to be substantially biased. Okay, that was sort of questions about a way of approaching using network methods, the extent to which various linguistic and cultural phenomena are tree-like. What about the extent to which different lineages are cohesive? There's a rather lovely paper by some people here that outlines, I think a lot of the problems with these debates is that they've been kind of highly polarized into those who say yes and those who say no. One of the nice things about this paper is that it outlines a sort of continuum of kind of possibilities for how cohesive different aspects of culture might be. At one extreme of a continuum is the view that cultures are like species. People like Mark Hagel and Ruth Mace have argued that cultures are like species, in that just as genes are tightly linked on chromosomes, different aspects of culture might be tightly integrated by shared worldview, by cultural group selection, and by kind of demographic events like the kind of colonization history I talked about in the Pacific. This is not a view that I think that is particularly plausible, but we need ways of kind of measuring this, which I'm going to come to in a minute. Another view might be that cultures contain some core traditions, and these are tightly linked together, but other aspects of culture have quite different histories that might conflict quite strongly with those core traditions. Going further along the continuum, there's a view that I call culture as a bit like a stew. It contains different chunks with different histories, but there's no core, cohesive, kind of basic traditions. And at the final end of the continuum, the history can't really explain anything. There's no cohesion to any different aspects of culture. Cultures are just collections of ephemeral entities. So putting those two issues together, one of the ways I like to kind of think about these different things is really what our job should be is to use methods to estimate where on a kind of multi-dimensional graph different aspects of culture lie. So on this axis I've shown relative time depth. It's our ability to estimate this would depend on the rate of change of vertically inherited traits. On this axis I've shown what I call the shape of aspects of culture. That is how tree-like or non-tree-like. And that'll be affected by the rate of horizontal transmission. And on this aspect I've shown what I call the fabric of cultural history, how cohesive different elements of culture might be. And the kind of task, and I think that something that needs to be much more theory about, is to say why it might be that things like morphosyntax are very stable, relatively unlikely to be borrowed, and apparently or allegedly kind of tightly linked. Whereas things like Gould's bow and arrows or other inventions can change at very high rates, can be very easily kind of borrowed. Okay, so the challenge I take in acknowledging some of the perils of using computational phylogenetic methods is to look at just how tree-like and just how cohesive different elements of cultureâ. So to finish off this talk, I want to switch from what's predominantly been the focus on kind of language and social organisation to material culture. Canoes are very important in the Pacific, and some of you may have seen some papers written by Deborah Rogers and Mark Elder and Paul Ehrlich looking at different aspects of canoe design. And remember I suggested that perhaps it was the invention of the outrigger canoe that led to the remarked rapid expansion in terms of the Pacific. I didn't say, but there's been also some suggestions that the large double-hull canoes were necessary for the expansion of the most remote parts of Polynesia. Now, Deborah Rogers and co. have done some analyses where they've argued that the physical aspects of canoe design, when they analyse them, are more evolutionary stable, are evolving less rapidly than the symbolic aspects of canoe design, which might be how the canoe is decorated, the kind of colours and feathers on the kind of prow, the decorations on the kind of sail. So they've argued that symbolic cultural traits, because they're not tested against the environment, can change more rapidly. And they've also argued in a recent paper that these aspects of canoe design give us a good estimate of population history. I want to dispute both those claims. So, if we take from the data set two partitions, one the symbolic traits and one the functional traits, and we can do two things. One, we can calculate those delta scores, which give an estimate of how tree-like they are. And you can see that first of all, these networks are strikingly non-tree-like. They don't map onto a language tree very well. And when we take our language trees and then map these individual cultural traits about canoe design onto them, you can calculate a likelihood score and use that to estimate how well they actually fit on those basic vocabulary trees. And you can see here that not only is its delta score lower, showing it's more tree-like the symbolic traits, but it fits slightly better on the language tree than the functional traits. And when we estimate the rates of change, we actually get exactly the opposite to what Deborah Rogers and Paul Ehrlich got. We find that the symbolic traits are actually changing more slowly on our language tree. So we use phylogenetic methods to estimate the rates of change. We find that symbolic traits, which perhaps mark group identity, local cultural identity, the way in which you decorate your canoe, is changing more slowly than the so-called functional traits. And I'm kind of shocked at the kind of naivety of their interpretation, because if you know a bit about the history of the Pacific, it turns out that not only was there kind of lots of borrowing of aspects of canoe technology, they literally borrowed the canoe builders quite commonly. So you might enter into systems of trade where you might exchange canoes, or you might, enable those excellent canoe builders from the neighbouring island to come across to your island and build you those fantastic canoes. But you will decorate them in the style of your own kind of local culture. So if there's anything that I think shouldn't track population history or settlement patterns well, it would be these kind of aspects of material canoe culture. So I kind of both reject their claims about the relative rates of evolution and also the idea that there is a kind of coherence between this aspect of material culture and the kind of linguistic aspects that I was kind of talking about. There's a very poor match between the kind of cultural histories here versus the kind of linguistic histories. Okay, to summarise, what I've been arguing is that we've come a very long way from Darwin's little drawing back in 1837, showing a kind of family tree. There's an enormous number of powerful things we can do by applying explicit computational methods to questions about language, culture, and prehistory. It enables us to answer hypotheses about the timing and spread of Pacific peoples. It enables us to make inferences about ancestral states of social organisation, and it enables us to test hypotheses about the sequence of changes in social and political complexity. But I've also argued that there are some perils, that we need to be aware that we shouldn't always assume that cultural evolution is like stereotypical vertebrate evolution. It might be much more like prokaryote evolution. But that doesn't mean we should abandon everything, go home and give up. Instead, it means that we should pursue these more network-based approaches, and rather than assuming these cultural lineages all cohere, quantify the extent to which these different histories show kind of common patterns. So I think there's enormous potential to apply more generally these kind of computational phylogeny methods, provided they're applied with caution and with some knowledge of what's happened in terms of the histories of the people in a particular area. Thank you.